Thank you. Thanks, Lucas. Normally I like to wander around, but it's a little bit constrained in this setting, so no, it'll be all right. Thank you. So we might actually shut that door. Is that okay, please? Okay, so to begin with, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, the Yugambeh people. I pay my respects to elders past, present and future, for they hold the memories, the traditions, the culture and hopes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So, a little bit about this presentation. So what I'm going to try and do for the next 35 minutes or so is to give you some information which hopefully you'll find entertaining and useful. That's my goal. I think that if you can gain something practical out of this experience and use it in your own workplace, then that'll be awesome. When I'm an audience member, I find it really distracting when other people talk. My hearing's not great, and that hearing sounds from different directions really makes it very difficult for me to concentrate. So please don't talk. If you find something really thought-provoking that I've said, or you find something really ridiculous, and you want to talk to the person next to you, can you please leave it until the end of the session? That'd be great. So, what do we mean when we're talking about information security awareness raising? And I'm just going to use the acronym ISAR because information security awareness raising is a bit of a mouthful. So, I find this definition quite useful. An employee's overall knowledge and understanding of potential issues related to information security and their ramifications. And those ramifications are really important, because if we want to embed a risk-aware mindset, then we need to be helping people understand what the potential consequences of their actions are. ISAR can also be broken down into three elements. That is knowledge, what do staff know about information security? Attitude, what do staff think about information security, including their perceptions? And their behaviour, how do staff actually behave with respect to information security? Now, in order to understand the situational context of any awareness-raising activity, we really need to understand those three elements. And for some reason, we have an auto-timing function on this PowerPoint presentation. So those three elements, when they're used in some means to measure the information security culture in an organisation, can be very useful as before measures. So you try and measure the culture, and that's not an easy thing to do. Then you put in place some sort of awareness-raising activity, and then you measure that culture again, and that's a really good before and after measure. So why is information security awareness raising important? Well, there's a number of reasons, but for me, information security awareness raising is a force multiplier, and a force multiplier is simply something that magnifies the effectiveness of something else, causing it to have a greater impact than it otherwise would. And the woomera is an example of a force multiplier. It's used in traditional Indigenous Australian cultures in lots of different areas, and it basically amplifies the force to a great extent of throwing a spear. So ISAR can be a force multiplier for a number of reasons. One is because it should be successful in driving more risk-aware behaviour. And that's important because that should result in fewer information security incidents. When people are more aware about the threats that they face and how to manage them, fewer incidents occur. Just as important as the threat knowledge itself is the positive impact this causes in staff because of the virtuous circle created by self-efficacy. And that means that the more people perceive that they have a role to play and that they can do something about information security, you can get them to, especially if they're identified and rewarded and promoted for doing the right thing, it helps them do the right thing more in the future. ISAR should also result in better compliance with information security policies and processes. Now, in and of itself, that's not necessarily beneficial. If your policies and procedures are appropriate for the organisation and they align with how business objectives are achieved, then yes, having people more compliant with policies will give you an organisational benefit. But if your policies aren't aligned, then it won't give you a benefit. So sometimes it's a good opportunity when you're doing an awareness-raising activity to get some feedback from staff about how they perceive the policies that you're asking them to comply with. That can be really important knowledge, because the people that write the policies sometimes don't ever really hear directly from the people who are meant to comply with the policy. So that feedback is really, really useful. ISAR is also a really important way to increase situational awareness. Basically, the more people are aware of their environment and the more that they're primed to identify information security vulnerabilities, the more likely they are to report them, and the more likely we all are to avoid those incidents occurring in the first place, because it's obviously much better to stop things before they occur than try and fix them later. ISAR can also be really valuable in the sense that it can make it easier to gain approval for information security initiatives in the organisation, both through formal approval channels, that is, people that actually approve whether you're going to do something or not. If they understand why information security is important and how it can help the organisation achieve its objectives, then they're more likely to listen to what you're saying and hopefully more likely to approve what you want to achieve. Obviously, how you frame that and how you explain it in relation to the broader organisational objectives is important, but if they already have a good feel for why information security is important, then you've got a greater chance of getting things approved. In terms of informal approval, if your initiatives are asking people to modify their behaviour, and almost every initiative will have some sense of people modifying their behaviour, if they know why they're doing it and why information security is important, then they're more likely to be a partner in the initiative rather than having something imposed upon them. It's a very different conversation when they already know why you're going to do it, or you're able to relate that fairly easily to the why. ISAR can also be a recruitment tool. So in large organisations, it's a really good way of identifying those staff who may not necessarily work in an information security role, but are really keen about it or are really enthusiastic, and maybe they do want to transition into the profession, and that can be incredibly valuable. We know it's becoming more and more difficult to recruit people in information security roles, so if you can get someone from within your organisation who already understands the organisational context, that can be highly valuable. In smaller organisations where you may not have dedicated information security staff, identifying those people that really care about information security and are keen can be really useful in terms of developing an informal, like a security champions network, or at least identifying those people who can be influencers within the organisation. You don't have to be in an official management role to be a leader. So ISAR, to some extent, can be a PR exercise between the information security team, even if that's multiple teams, and the rest of the organisation. And like any PR exercise, it can backfire. So you need to be very careful with your messaging, and you need to be open to having those conversations with people that may be a little bit uncomfortable, particularly if there's been a perception in the organisation that InfoSec are just there to tell them what to do. Having the ability to show them that there's more to InfoSec than being told what to do can really help that PR element of how you function and what you're trying to achieve. So, who knows, who's heard of TAE? Hands up who's heard of TAE. So, my apologies for those of you that have heard of TAE. So look, I won't read that, I find that wording quite ridiculous. But anyway, look, Microsoft decided that they were going to demonstrate how wonderful some of their artificial intelligence capability was by creating this thing called TAE. TAE was an automated Twitter bot. It learnt from people tweeting at it, and then it theoretically responded to conversations in an appropriate human-like fashion. Now, unfortunately for TAE, she didn't get the best of the internet engaging her in conversations, and as a result, she only lasted about 16 hours before she was permanently retired due to sending racist, sexist and drug-related tweets. ISAR can be a catalyst for positive change. So that goes back to what I was saying about changing the way that information security is perceived in the organisation. It really gives you an opportunity for people to be really open and honest with you if you're willing to listen to them. It's also a really awesome way for people to get in touch with you and say, listen, I've been working on this project and we're doing these really risky things and I just don't have anybody to talk about it and it actually really worries me. Getting people to report those vulnerabilities to you is highly valuable. Now, the flip side of force multipliers are these things I call force dissolvers. So those practices within the organisation which reduce the impact of information security. I mention them here because I think they're important to identify force dissolvers and try and get rid of them as much as we can. It's already quite a difficult job, and if we can identify those things that are making it harder for us and then eliminate them, then that'd be great. So force dissolvers, for example, are leaders who don't follow the rules, and that's the really important difference between espoused behaviour, what you say you're going to do, and enacted behaviour, what you actually do. Fairness and sense-making are powerful drivers in most people, so processes and policies that don't make sense won't change people's behaviour. So they need to be personally relevant and rational. And then you have organisational practices that actually contradict what you're trying to achieve. For example, you might have very sound privacy policies in relation to collecting information from the public, but very poor information practices when you collect information from your own staff. So these things are important to identify and get rid of if we can. So let's talk a little bit about the theory of how people learn. Engagement is a critical element to any kind of learning. There's different theories about people learn, but one of them highlights the importance of what's called situated learning, which simply means the situations in which people learn, including their environment and their mindset. Situated learning emphasises higher order or systematic processing of the message being imparted to the learner, which is critical for knowledge transfer to real-world problem solving to occur. Situated learning depends upon seeing a learning problem as important, personally relevant, and involves the value of actions in the learning situation and the learner having decision-making responsibilities. Now, this also ties nicely into what we want to achieve in relation to information security responsibility. You know, it's very common for people to hear the message, security is everybody's problem. Now, if we can really impart that in a meaningful way, then that ties in with how people learn by the theory of situated learning. So you want them to know this information is relevant to you because these are your responsibilities and this is what you can do to make the situation better. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So training should specifically contain motivation for the learner so that they engage in systematic or higher order cognitive processing. If they don't see a motivation that's relevant to them, then they're almost certainly not going to engage and they're not going to learn anything. Many information security threats are intangible and difficult for lay people to relate to, which negatively impacts on plausibility and therefore their motivation of the learner. Fire is a tangible and visceral threat. It's easy for people to relate to. We don't have to explain it, everybody gets it. But information security threats, on the other hand, are often much more intangible, particularly if people have not been personally negatively impacted. So in an intangible context, when people don't really relate to what you're trying to tell them, they fall back to what are called secondary learning channels, and trustworthiness of the advice source is a critical element of that. But this relies on what are called cues for knowledge transfer, which are far less effective and less reliable than if you get that direct engagement via the higher order thinking processes. So other sorts of cues apart from trustworthiness are the reactions of people in the learning setting, external rewards, the attractiveness of the speaker, the number of arguments, and the use of gaffs as well, graphs and statistics. So some of those things we can change and some of them we can't change. So the point is we need to make threats tangible wherever we can because that gets that primary communications method going and helps people learn better. So one way to achieve that tangibility or the way that people relate to threats is to use stories or the use of cases. This thing. So stories can be an active learning and can create an active and learning environment and counteract optimism bias. And optimism bias is the belief that many people have that they won't be the victim of something because they're different to everybody else. So telling people tangible stories that relate a situation that they can relate to really helps get rid of that bias. So telling stories is a really important way to get through to people. Anybody understand this reference?
Never-ending story.
Never-ending story, that's right. So this nice gentleman is called Lamal, and he sang a song in the 80s called Never-ending Story, which was the title song to the children's film Never-ending Story. So I know I'm drawing a long bow here, but I just couldn't resist Lamal's beautiful hair. If there's one thing better than cheesy 80s music, it's 80s pop music hairstyles. So security fatigue. It's something that we need to take into account because staff can feel bombarded with information and switch off their attention. So we need to be careful not to overwhelm them with too much information too frequently. And sometimes that can be difficult in an organisation where you may not be aware of other messaging or you might not be able to control when messaging happens. So you need to be mindful of the fact that people, even if your message is beautifully pitched and well presented, if they just can't take it in because they're in an information overloaded state, it's probably not going to cut through. Like think about induction when you start a new job. Most people have induction where they get through a huge amount of information in a short amount of time, and you have to ask yourself, are these people really learning this stuff? Are they remembering this stuff? So maybe if you have the option, it might be better not to include information security information in an induction process that's chock-a-block. It might be better to delay it a little bit so you've got more opportunity to actually cut through and avoid this security fatigue. Because reflection is a really critical element to learning. If you don't have time to reflect on the message that's being imparted, you're probably not going to remember it very well. And when everything's chocked in together, you don't have time for reflection. Now, fear appeals are persuasive messages that use fear to try and change behaviour. Fear appeals can be counterproductive if they're not used correctly. Anybody understand this reference? What is it? Yeah, it was an ad that was released in Australia in, I think it was the late 1980s. It might have been the mid-1980s, to try and educate people about the threat that HIV represented to the general public. So it wasn't just targeted at those people who were more likely to contract HIV. It was a community-based campaign, and it used a Grim Reaper message that was quite frightening, together with a very clear message as to how to avoid the threat. So fear appeals in general need to be carefully pitched. Self-efficacy and response efficacy are particularly important. So self-efficacy is someone's perception of whether they can use this thing you're trying to tell them to use, and response efficacy is whether they think it's going to be effective. Those two things are critically important when you're talking about fear appeals. So to maximise the chances of success when communicating threats, you need to take into account social norms and organisational culture. You need to have clear, simple and step-by-step messages that seem achievable to the people you're communicating with. You need to make it easy for people to do the right thing by having information security as part of processes rather than an add-on. And you need to be consistent in messaging and behaviour, particularly by people who are in positions of authority or influence. They need to be setting a good example. So let's talk about the awareness raising campaign that I ran in a state government department last year. Also, I forgot to mention at the top of the program that this presentation or anything I say has nothing to do with my current employer, who I won't identify, just letting you know. So the core training message of the campaign that I ran was a stop, think, act message, and that's adapted from a workplace health and safety. Lots of workplace health and safety campaigns use this same messaging. And it simply breaks down to the fact that I want people to stop, think about the security risks that they need to consider. And the think component is, what are the risks and what are the impacts? So a little basic, simple risk assessment kind of equation. And then act appropriately, implement security protection according to risk. And asking for help is a really important and legitimate action. Not everybody knows what to do in every situation, but if they know that asking for help is completely a great thing to do, then that really helps them understand how they can be a part of the solution, because we want people to be part of the solution. And asking for help And then being told when they do how awesome it was that they did ask for help is really important. And in any, look, I think in any information security initiative in an organisation of reasonable size, whatever you call your help desk function are really important partners for you. And I strongly recommend getting to know them and making sure that they understand that they're critically important. That when people report incidents to them, that's a really good thing, because we need to know what's going on the ground. And we need to encourage people to report, particularly if they've made a mistake. They need to be empowered to know that reporting an incident is actually a really positive thing. Not reporting an incident, that's completely different. So part of the training message is the idea of reinforcing the point that staff have choices to make in relation to information and how they use it. And the Stop, Think, Act message is obviously designed to get people to recognise the fact they have choices to make. They can make a difference or not, depending on what their actions are. And I used rational choice theory as a decision-making framework to explain to them in a really simple way one theory about how people make decisions. Rational choice theory isn't a perfect decision-making model by any means, but it's relatively simple to explain to people. So I used it as part of the training to try and get them to identify that there is a decision-making process going on up here. Even if we don't normally break it down to its component parts, it still happens. And I want them to see that they have a part to play in the decisions that they make. Now, the main body of the training structure was a 2-hour face-to-face training session. There were 29 sessions overall with 270 staff trained. I had the luxury of working in an organisation where there were around 300 or so staff members in this particular business unit. Not everybody's going to have that luxury. Some people have a huge user base that they need to try and train. So what I would suggest is that this face-to-face training, which has the highest time cost, but I think the most likely payoff in terms of engagement and behavioural change, just use it selectively. Use it on those high-risk cohorts in your organisation, especially executives, because you need their buy-in to do all sorts of things. Apart from the 2-hour face-to-face training sessions, we also did phishing simulations, some org-wide, some specifically targeted to try and get some metrics. During the training, we fished some people that had done the training and hadn't done the training and then compared them. We also developed an information security liaison officer network, or a security champions kind of network, occasional one-off ad hoc email messages, and department-wide online training, which I had no control of, but had to try and segue into. So at every stage along the journey here, all this messaging was broken down and compared back to Stop, Think, Act. So everything was Stop, Think, Act. Now, the training sessions, the 2-hour face-to-face training sessions, in summary, the content was basically shake it up, do lots of different things. Lecturing periods were kept short to an absolute minimum of maybe 15 minutes, maybe 20 minutes, and combined with frequent opportunities for interaction. I didn't purport to understand all the people in the organisation and what their knowledge was, or what their goals were, or what their pain points were. So the ability to get this frequent interaction from those staff members had a number of benefits. One, it kept them awake and interested. Two, it allowed me to get information from them, which is really important, and helped me change the content as I went along. It allows them to have a little opportunity for reflection. So if I ask a question that's related to the content I'm trying to impart, it gets them to personalise that message and think, oh, how does this relate to me? Now, most of that reflection and two-way communication flow was achieved through questions to the learning audience, such as, what are some reasons why staff don't comply with information security policies? So I would ask the question. I didn't give them all the answers. I wanted them to give me the answers. So I'd say, what do you reckon? Why don't people comply with policies? And they told me, like, I had probably half this list when I started, and the other half came as a direct result of getting feedback from staff. So that was really useful information for me. So there's all sorts of things, you know, policy was a barrier to getting real work done, blah, 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 blah. Now, the bottom one was the infamous malicious insider, that person within your organisation who actively wants to do you harm. They're very difficult to defend against. They're very difficult to identify, but I just happen to have a photo of one here. Now, I used to put this slide fairly early in my presentation because it gave me an opportunity to explain to the audience that the jokes in the presentation were not for their benefit. They were for my benefit when I saw the pained expression on their faces as to how poor the quality of the jokes were. So what does success look like in this space? Sorry, that's the wrong photo. Right up. What does success look like? It depends on the objectives that you're trying to achieve, obviously. So when you set out on something like this, you need to be really sure about what you're trying to achieve. And you need to make sure that each of those aims are linked to a measurable objective. So you can say, well, we set out to do this, and that's what we achieved. So you might have objectives along the lines of reducing the number of human-caused information security incidents. And when I set out, I had a look at the incident register and I found one information security incident in the past 2 years related to human activity. Obviously that wasn't right, it's just that people weren't reporting. So we changed the content to include a little slide on why reporting is really important, and I told them exactly what I told you just then. If we don't know what's going on in the organisation, we can't address those incidents and we can't help you avoid those incidents. And phishing simulation is really good for, it has its limitations, absolutely no question, but one of the things it's really good for is reporting, because you know how many messages you sent out, you know how many messages were read, and you know how many people reported it if you have a good relationship with your help desk. And that's why I was talking before about that relationship building. So if they got deluged with 60 or 70 phone calls in the first few days that you run your campaign, it was important for me to let them know, this is really good, this is a good thing, and I know it's annoying for you, but we need it for these reasons. And once I explained that, they were totally on board with it. So metrics. Compliance-based metrics are easy, but may not be terribly useful. So the number of staff that attended training, you know, it's useful to some extent. Whether you mentioned required compliance activities that staff needed to be aware of, that's pretty much a tick box. But because engagement with the course material is such a critical part of the learning process, how do you measure engagement? Well, not like that, obviously. I mean, the scale isn't even in line with the ring, so that's ridiculous. So what we did was that we created some post-training surveys, so quick, easy to fill in surveys that I asked staff to fill in when they completed the training. And it covered a 5-point scale on, you know, fairly obvious things, most interesting topics, blah, blah, blah. When people did that feedback, it was anonymous, and I left the room when they filled it in to give them a feeling of being able to be free, because I really wanted them to tell me brutally, honestly, what they thought about the training. And you can't really see those statistics, but on a 5-point scale, the one that scored the lowest was the time taken to do the activity, and even that was 4.3 out of 5, which is pretty good. So a lot of people said, well, 2 hours is a bit long, but they still, you know, averagely, the scores are pretty good. We did a pilot group, and that was the information security committee in the organisation. Trained them first and got some really good feedback. I made sure I invited lots of people I knew within the government to come and do the training and sit alongside the workers, and that feedback was great, and it also helped me build some really good relationships that I didn't have prior to that. 17 iterations of the material we used, so most of these are fairly small changes, but my point is that I was able to modify it as I went along to improve it based upon the feedback I was getting from the people that were being trained. And the other thing that we did to try and measure effectiveness in terms of whether people's behaviour or attitudes or knowledge were changed was to implement 2 focus groups. Now, ideally, you'd like to do a broad-based data gathering exercise like a survey, but in this organisation it was going through not a restructure, but a realignment, and people were getting surveyed to death. There was just no space in people's days for any more surveys. So I didn't do a survey, but we did do focus groups on 2 groups, and they were really important to get that really rich data from people about how they felt. So we asked them specific questions about knowledge, attitude and behaviour, although that behaviour is self-reported, so it's not completely reliable, it was still a really useful exercise. And the fact that incident reporting rates went up like this. Obviously, phishing campaigns are very difficult to compare like for like because the difficulty level changes all the time. So, I mean, click-through rates are an interesting statistic, but it's not always correlatable. So reporting rates, that's a little bit different, I think. So what worked? Videos are a really great way of breaking up the lectures, focus attention and provide stories. Mixed cohorts worked better. When I had one group where I had a line manager and 3 of his staff, and that was terrible. They just didn't want to talk about anything, so we specifically avoided that. Mornings were better than afternoons. People's energy levels were greater in the mornings than in the afternoons. And clearly focused, narrow, easy to understand exercises were much better than nebulous ones. So early on, I asked people, please describe a situation where information security went wrong or was ineffective. And people just couldn't relate to that question. I thought it'd be really good data, but they were just like, oh, I don't know what you mean. So we changed that to be a really simple information security classification exercise. Here's some data. What do you reckon the labels should be? Just line them up. And that worked heaps better. The participatory elements of the training and the measurements running the focus groups was really satisfying for the staff I had working with me. I had a comms person and an administrative person who never did anything with information security prior to this training. And we really formed a useful team. And the fact that they really enjoyed it, that was really rewarding for me. And it turned them into security champions as well. These people who otherwise didn't necessarily care about information security, they were totally on board. Security operations team gained a staff member because one of the training sessions, one of the participants at the end said to me, I really like information security, I'd like to do that for a job. And I said, well, I'll put you in touch with the guy that runs the team. And eventually he joined that team. So that was a good result. How are we going for time? Yep. Interesting future stuff that I won't talk about right now, but I think is potentially really interesting in the information security space. Mindsets and how people perceive things, that they could be potentially very powerful. Information aversion is the phenomenon that people don't like getting bad news. It actually triggers a part in their brain that causes them discomfort or pain. And when you start trying to tell someone bad news, sometimes they automatically shut down their attention because they feel bad. So how we pitch information security messages is critical, because if they think they're just going to get bad information from you, they're not going to listen to what you're saying. Other decision-making models apart from rational choice theory, like I think prospect theory has a lot more relevance in this space. And personality profiles generally I think are hopeless, but there's one called the 4 tendencies, which I think is really useful, and there's stuff that you can do online for free to investigate that, that model. I think sense-making is really critical to how people perceive threats, and most people have an innate need to make sense of the world. I also know as an information security professional, it sometimes can be incredibly frustrating that people don't listen to you when you're talking complete logic and rational information. So I think it'd be a really interesting research project to get information security professionals to try and do a little bit of research on the people they are trying to change or impart information to. In so doing, those professionals might take their own person out of the equation. So if you can observe a phenomenon and go, oh, that's really interesting, they're not listening, I wonder why they're not listening, rather than thinking, you're an idiot, why can't you listen to me, can really change that equation and perhaps lower the stress levels. And that's the end of the presentation.
Right, that's perfect timing there. We have a couple of questions via the CERT app. So if you do have any questions, please submit it. They are open in every single session as well. So first I'd like to thank Mark. Thank you very much, Mark. That was a fabulous presentation. And if only everyone listened to InfoSec professionals, right?
Well, me in particular, yes.
Right, yeah, so I'll just ask a couple of the questions that popped up. So the first one's from also Mark. What's the best way to gain or recruit security champions?
Well, I think having some kind of awareness activity, that especially one that's broad-based and includes the whole organisation, and asking for feedback, being very clear that this is a two-way flow of comms, they'll just come up out of the woodwork. That's been my experience, that if you tell them, I really want to know what you think, they'll tell you. And then you can identify them and say, oh, okay, then you can have that conversation. You just know when you talk to someone who really cares, it'll come out. Does that answer the question?
The second question was from Stephanie. How do you identify the content required for the 2-hour face-to-face training?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we had a number of criteria that we needed to meet. So tick in the box on compliance, that was one of them. Looking at what I thought was an important base level of knowledge that everybody should have in relation to information security. Like I said, when I started, I wanted to say to people, now in this organisation, we have 3 people clicking on actual phishing links in the last 6 months. But that data just didn't exist. So one of the criteria that then went into the training was tell people why reporting is important. And then that helped us fix, it helped just reveal so much more that we weren't aware of in the past. And as I said, there were 17 iterations of this material. So it changed as we went along based upon what I could see was working and not. You know, when you're talking to an audience and they just glazed over or they're asleep and they're just not getting it. So those times, or like when I did short exercises that the people being trained were asked to do, I'd float around the room and look over their shoulders and see what how that was going. And you could just tell the buzz, people talking, sometimes even about the topic you asked them to talk about. That gave me some good feedback. Oh, that material works, that material doesn't work. So it just changed over time. And I always read the surveys. After every session, I read the surveys. And that led me to introduce some new material. One of the questions was, what else would you like to hear about? Or what don't you want to hear about? And that we just changed it as we went along as a result of the feedback.
All right, so that's all the questions online. Were there any questions in here that anyone might have? Well, thank you very much, Mark.